I was very much interested in freedom because we were told to care about freedom. I remember that I believed that I was free and, that I lived in a free state. Hi, I'm Lea Ypi. I'm a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And this is my story of growing up in Albania, the last Stalinist outpost in Europe. Albania is a small country. It was a communist country from 1945 to 1990, which is when the transition happened and communism fell apart and we had a liberal state. Life as a child in Albania was very monotonous. You would go to school wearing your school uniform and your red scarf if you were a pioneer. We were in school every day of the week except for Sunday. Then after that, you just come home and your parents were usually at work. Grandparents were really important because they stayed with the children while parents were working. The society was very heavily politicized and children were brought up with a very strong political consciousness, with the idea of belonging to a socialist state and of being proud. When I grew up, I knew that something about me was different. I knew that also Albania as such was different as a country. Growing up in Albania, information about the outside world was censored by the party and people were punished for watching films that shouldn't be watched or for reading books that shouldn't be read, but which were nevertheless smuggled from either the West or from Soviet Russia. There was also, however, especially in the town in which I grew up, Durrës, which was on the Adriatic coast, often a signal from Italy that you would pick up through the television. So information about the outside world was either the kind of information that would be given on state television through filtered through state propaganda and told from the point of view of the party, or in the newspapers. Or on the other hand, it would be this information that came uncensored through these other means that were not that were punished, but that people nevertheless had access to and were very keen to find out about. There were products from the outside world that made it into Albania. Often they were brought in by sailors or by lorry transport workers that went to export Albanian goods in other countries. And so I remember, for example, that if you were really lucky, a relative or a friend who had traveled abroad would bring you like a big pen or nylon stockings. And sometimes they would bring you a chewing gum or a sweet that had a label that was different from the kinds of labels that we had in Albania. And we kept collections of these chewing gum wrappers. And we would, in school, often trade it with each other and play with these wrappers. In 1990, there were a number of protests on the streets, and in December 1990, there was a protest at the University of Tirana, which started as a student protest with students demanding better living conditions. And this was 1 year after the Berlin Wall had fallen, so we had assumed up to that point that a lot of the changes that affected East Central Europe, that affected the Soviet world, that affected the Cold War, because we were outside of the Soviet sphere of influence, wouldn't necessarily affect Albania, and that we would pursue this autonomous path to socialism, which we had always had up to that point. But then in 1990, something began to change with the student movements. The moment in which I realized that there was massive change happening was when we were standing in front of the television and the secretary of the Albanian Labour Party, which was sort of communist party, declared that political pluralism was no longer a punishable offense and that there would be new free elections. And I remember being very interested and very curious because up to that point I had always thought that elections were free. I had seen my parents vote, I'd seen, an election campaign to some extent, and I had seen also enthusiasm about going to the polls. Usually elections under communism happened very, very early in the morning. People would all go and queue up for voting at, already at 5 or 6, and by 9 o'clock results were already declared. And so at one point I remember the secretary of the Albanian Labour Party declaring political pluralism, and my parents saying now there would be free elections, and explaining to me what free elections entailed, that there would be a multi-party system where different parties would be running up for the election with different programs and different platforms, and they could then decide on the basis of these different platforms what policies to have and what laws to make. And again, this was a very perplexing point, and I remember talking to one of my friends saying, well, what will they decide? And I remember we had this conversation about God, and will the parties then start saying God is real, and will that make God real or not? And so we had all these conversations around what kind of things would be up for grab in the new elections. Nothing could be taken for granted. I grew up thinking about freedom because in school we were taught to care about freedom. We were in a country that was promoting socialist ideals, and where the idea of socialism was that socialism was a liberating theory that would free the exploited and the oppressed all over the world, and had already freed Albania from the yoke of fascists and rendered it autonomous. I was very much interested in freedom because we were told to care about freedom. I remember that I believed that I was free, and that I lived in a free state that was attempting to realize freedom. And then in 1990, it was the first time in which things changed, and I perceived a difference between how I thought the society in which I lived was and how my parents were responding to the changes. In a way, the conflicts and the questions concerning the idea of what is freedom and how do we live freedom and how can we be responsible is actually, it's still my biggest question right now, and it's the question that shapes the book. And through the different characters that populated my life and those that I came in contact with, I try to think about different ideas of freedom that characterized them and that oriented their actions in the world. So, for example, I think of my mother as someone who embodies a kind of what some might call a negative idea of freedom, where you are free when the state doesn't tell you what to do, what to wear, what to say. And so that's a kind of purely liberal idea of freedom. On the other hand, my father had a slightly different conception of freedom. He had a more, what one might call, positive conception of freedom, where it's freedom to realize certain things and freedom to have access to certain opportunities. And then my grandmother has what I call a kind of very moral idea of freedom, because she grew up in a system and in a society of privilege, and then when she moved to Albania, she became persecuted, and my grandfather ended up in prison, she ended up deported, she lost all her privileges and was working in the fields. And she didn't, though, ever think that she had lost her freedom, because she believed that freedom is, for as long as you retain your dignity, you are always free, and you have the most important freedom of all, which is a kind of moral freedom. And so in my grandmother's case, she had always been, regardless of the changes of circumstances and regardless of the oppression around her, she thought she had always been morally free, and also free to act in a responsible way and to take responsibility for the actions that she committed, regardless of the structural constraints around those actions. There can be different kinds of impediments to freedom. So in a socialist society, you have, at least in a socialist society that we had in Albania, there were certain kind of impediment of freedom. So you couldn't wear what you wanted, or you couldn't go where you liked, or you couldn't travel wherever you wanted to. You couldn't say anything that crossed your mind because there was state censorship, and so this was a very significant, sort of robust lack of freedom. But on the other hand, in a liberal society, you could also not do these things, not because you weren't free to talk, but because there was a sense in which structures were making it very difficult for individuals to realize what they wanted to realize. Yes, you could travel freely, but if you didn't have money, you couldn't travel freely. Yes, you could go on holiday wherever you wanted to, but if you couldn't afford your holiday because you were working several jobs and because you couldn't make a living for your family, then that was also insignificant. But ultimately, I believe that if you understand freedom in this sort of more robust way, and if you sort of think about what freedom is, then it's very hard to see how freedom has been realized for everyone, everywhere in the world, because it seems to me that we live in societies that are very divided, are shaped by differences of, class, ethnicity, race, gender, and that which group of people you belong in these categories matters to what kind of opportunities for freedom you have. And it seems to me that the idea that everyone lives freely and that we all live in a free society is just not there, and in fact is sort of almost like an ideological delusion that we have. And just like in communist Albania, I grew up thinking that I was free. I believe that there is a similar form of ideological delusion that shapes our institutions, where we say, well, we're free and we are advancing freedom, and that in fact what you see is often cracks in the system, injustices and exploitation and remainders that always show you that there's always someone somewhere whose freedom is severely hindered. Thanks for watching. You can get my new book free in hardback and audio by clicking on the link below. And don't forget to subscribe to Penguin Channels for more videos like this.